The night Adrian Blackthorne walked into a room, people stopped breathing. Not from admiration, from something older than that. The kind of animal instinct that made prey freeze when a predator moved too close. 12 years he had ruled Blackthorne territory with a silence more devastating than any threat. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. The Duke simply looked at a man, and that man would spend the following week reconsidering every decision that had led him to this moment. But tonight, in the gilded ballroom of Harwick Palace, surrounded by 500 witnesses and the sweet rot of powdered ambition, someone had made a catastrophic mistake. Someone had touched what belonged to him. The evening had started dying long before anyone noticed the body. Lord Harwick's autumn masquerade was the sort of event that existed purely as a stage for English aristocracy to perform its favorite theater. Wealth performing concern, power performing humility, desire performing discretion. Chandeliers bled gold across the marble floors. String quartets played Vivaldi with the enthusiasm of men fulfilling contractual obligations. Women in silk moved like ships in heavy water, their masks doing nothing to hide ambitions worn plainly in the eyes. Evelyn Carter stood near the East Terrace doors with a glass of champagne she had not touched, watching the room with the particular stillness of a person who had grown up learning to be invisible. She wore pale ivory tonight, the mask at her face trimmed with small cream roses, her own small act of defiance against the elaborate peacock displays surrounding her. At 22, she had been inside enough ballrooms to understand that beauty without weaponization was simply target practice for women who had learned to weaponize theirs. She was not naive. She was, however, genuinely unprepared for what was moving through the crowd toward her. "You look like someone counting exits," said the voice beside her. She turned. Lord Colton Marsh, third son of a shipping baron, face pleasant enough, ambition not hidden in the slightest, materialized at her elbow with the practiced ease of a man who believed his own charm was structural. "I always count exits," Evelyn said. "Good habit." "Miss Carter." He smiled with all his teeth. "I've been trying to find a moment to speak with you privately for 3 weeks." "I know." That seemed to knock something loose in his rhythm. "You know?" "You've attended 4 events I attended. You positioned yourself near the Harwick Library during last Tuesday's dinner, which is where I typically spend the second hour of any gathering because the music out here makes my head ache." She glanced at him, not unkindly. "You're not difficult to read, Lord Marsh." Something flickered in his expression. Recalibration, then doubling down. "Then perhaps you'll also read that my intentions are entirely honorable. Your father's estate," "My father's estate," she said quietly, "is not a conversation I'm having tonight. Miss Carter, you must understand that a woman in your position, without direct male guidance, the legal protections for your inheritance are managed by the Duke." His voice shifted. The pleasant mask slipped, just slightly. "Which brings its own set of complications, doesn't it? A young unmarried woman living under the protection of a man like Adrian Blackthorne. People talk, you know." Evelyn looked at him then, really looked at him. And something in her expression caused Lord Marsh to take one involuntary step backward. "People," she said, "have always talked. The remarkable thing is how little it changes anything." She turned back toward the room. Lord Marsh, recalibrating again, made the mistake that would define the rest of his evening. He reached out and took her arm. Not roughly. The gesture was almost casual, the kind of touch that men like him had been making for centuries, the proprietary claiming of attention they'd decided they were owed. His fingers wrapped around her elbow, and he leaned in close enough that she could smell the brandy underneath the cologne. "I think," he said, quietly enough for only her, "that you'd do well to consider your options before—" The hand disappeared. Not because Marsh released it, because something behind him had removed it. The room did not go silent. Too large, too loud, the string quartet still sawing valiantly through Vivaldi. But there was a ripple. The particular human phenomenon of attention turning at the same moment. A collective inhale that moved through the crowd in a wave, beginning at the East Terrace doors and spreading outward like something dropped in still water. Adrian Blackthorne stood behind Lord Marsh with the other man's wrist in his hand. I was in black, as he always was. The masquerade required costume, and his concession had been a dark half-mask that covered nothing meaningful. The jaw still hard enough to cut glass, the mouth set in the particular configuration that Evelyn had long ago learned to identify as the outermost surface of something significantly colder, underneath. He was 6'3" and built like a man who had decided at some point that his body was a tool and had maintained it accordingly. In a room full of English lords performing authority, the Duke of Blackthorn simply occupied it, the air around him denser, the light slightly less adequate, the comfortable social math of the room suddenly wrong in ways no one could immediately calculate. I was holding Marsh's wrist the way one might hold a document. One intended to read carefully before discarding. My lord, Marsh's voice came out remarkably well, considering. I know what you were doing. Adrian's voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That's why we're having this conversation. Marsh laughed. A social reflex, nervous, badly calibrated. Duke Blackthorn, surely this is hardly the occasion for release. The single word landed like a physical thing. Marsh went still. Adrian opened his hand, and the man's wrist dropped as if it had forgotten what to do with itself. Several lords nearby found sudden urgent interest in their champagne. Evelyn watched the Duke's eyes move from Marsh to her, and felt, as she always felt in that particular moment of being looked at by Adrian Blackthorn, the strange doubling of being completely seen and completely unable to decipher what the scene meant. You're all right, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm fine, she said. He was just leaving. Marsh was in fact already leaving. The dissolution of his body from the scene was almost impressive in its speed for a man trying to maintain dignity. Within 30 seconds he had dematerialized into the crowd with the efficiency of someone who had correctly assessed his odds. Adrian did not watch him go. He was still looking at her. That was the thing about being looked at by this man. The quality of his attention was different from other people's. Most gazes slid across surfaces. Adrian's went through them. The way deep water looked clear from above, but was something else entirely once you were in it. You didn't call for anyone, Chuck, he said. I had it handled. He had his hand on you. I was aware of his hand on me. She finally took a sip of the champagne, found it flat, and set it on a passing servant's tray with the precise motion of someone who had been raised to never set anything down carelessly. Adrian, I'm not a 14 anymore. Something moved across his expression. Slight, controlled, gone before she could name it. No, he said. You're not. The string quartet shifted pieces. The room breathed out. Come, he said. Harwick's put his study off limits tonight, which means there's a room without 40 people performing at each other. That sounds remarkably like exactly what I want, she said, and followed him without examining the fact of how easily she followed him. 12 years. That was how long she had been in his orbit, and the strange gravity of it had become simply the weather of her life, present, powerful, something she moved through rather than questioned. She had been 10 years old when Adrian Blackthorn arrived at the ruins of what her parents' death had left behind, and she had called him Brother Adrian for years afterward, in the guileless way of a child who needed the world to have stable architecture. He had told her, exactly twice, to stop. She hadn't stopped. Eventually he had. The study was small by Harwick standards, bookshelves floor to ceiling, a fireplace doing honest work against October, 2 chairs positioned by the window overlooking the garden where the party's overflow had spilled into the cold. Adrian did not take either chair. He stood at the window with his hands behind his back in the way he always stood when he was thinking through something he had not yet decided to speak aloud. Evelyn sat. She was one of perhaps 8 people in England who could sit comfortably in the same room as Adrian Blackthorn's silence. She had grown up in it. She understood its textures the way musicians understood key changes. Marsh is a problem, he said finally. Marsh is manageable. He's been attending your social calendar systematically for a month. He's made inquiries about your estate's legal structure with 3 separate solicitors. She looked up at him. You've been watching him. I watch everyone who approaches you. The flatness of it, the absolute absence of apology in the statement, was something she had stopped finding surprising around the time she turned 18. Adrian moved through the world with the certainty of a man who had long ago decided that certain things were his responsibility and that the feelings of others regarding that decision were irrelevant data. That must be exhausting, she said. No, he said, simply. She studied his profile against the window glass, the city lights beyond the garden catching the edges of him, the sharp line of jaw, the set of his shoulders. There was something different tonight. She could not have named it precisely, but the air in the room had a different pressure than usual. He said people talk, she said, about me living under your protection. People always talk. I know. I told him the same thing. She paused. But he wasn't entirely wrong about the optics, Adrian. I'm 22. The situation is... The situation, he said, turning from the window, and his voice had an edge in it she hadn't heard in exactly this configuration before, is that you are safe, your estate is protected, and anyone attempting to profit from your parents' deaths has encountered, and will continue to encounter, consequences. That's not what I was going to say. I know what you were going to say. You don't, she said, and something in her own voice surprised her, a firmness that pushed back against his certainty instead of accommodating it. You think you do. You've been deciding what I'm about to say since I was 10 years old, Adrian, and it's accurate consistently, infuriating consistently. She stood up. I was going to say that I understand the reasons, and I'm not suggesting I want to leave. I'm simply noting that it creates a particular kind of social... Evelyn. She stopped. He said her name in that way. Not loud, not dramatic, simply the sound placed in the air with precise intention, and her whole body recognized it the way it recognized the particular creak of certain floorboards in Blackthorn Manor, knowledge written into muscle and reflex over years. I know, he said, quieter now, that it's not a simple position. I've never pretended otherwise. She looked at him carefully. The firelight caught the planes of his face, and for a moment she saw beneath the controlled surface the thing she occasionally glimpsed and always immediately looked away from. Something that was not coldness, was never coldness, was in fact the opposite of coldness being maintained at enormous ongoing cost. She looked away, as she always did. Let's go back, she said, before people assume we've done something worth talking about. His jaw tightened slightly. After. After what? After you tell me if Marsh touched you anywhere other than your arm. The question was so quiet and so absolutely serious that she felt the temperature of the conversation shift. This was the thing about Adrian Blackthorn, that the rest of the world understood as cruelty, and that she had always understood as something more complex and less comfortable than cruelty. The absolute completeness of whatever he decided to protect. It wasn't performance. It had never been performance. It was the particular madness of a man who had decided, at some point long before she understood what decisions like that cost, that her safety was a thing he would maintain at any price he was required to pay. He didn't, she said. Adrian nodded once. The conversation was apparently closed. They returned to the ballroom, and Evelyn was aware, as she was always vaguely aware, but more sharply tonight, of how the room rearranged itself around his presence. Men straightened, women's eyes moved to him and then carefully away. The invisible social hierarchy of the space reconfigured with Adrian at the undisputed apex, and Evelyn moving through the space beside him with the peculiar status that proximity to that kind of power conferred. She watched women watch him. She had watched this for years. The fear in some faces, the hunger in others, the complex mixture in most. The Tyrant Duke. She had heard the name so many times it had ceased to mean anything to her. A story other people told about someone she had never actually met, because the man she knew had always shown her a different face than the one he showed the world, or perhaps the same face, through a different lens. She wasn't sure lately, which. The thought followed her through 2 hours of social performance, through a dinner where she was seated 3 places from Adrian and could feel, without looking, the precise location of his attention in the room, the way one could feel the heat of a fire without looking directly at it. It was Lord Ferris who made the next mistake. Edmund Ferris was 63 years old, carried the weight of old money and older sins with the ease of a man who had never been seriously challenged, and had been, though Evelyn did not yet know this, one of 3 men who had signed a particular document 11 years ago that she would spend the better part of the next year trying to find. He was drunk by 11 o'clock, not visibly, in the way of men with long practice at functional drunkenness, and he made his way to her side near the East Garden doors with the comfortable confidence of someone who believed his age entitled him to say whatever he was about to say. Miss Carter. The bow was correct, formal, unpleasant in some quality beneath the surface. Enjoying the evening? Reasonably, she said. Remarkable, isn't it? Harwick's parties. The sheer number of people who want to be seen in the same room. He took a sip of his wine and looked out at the garden. You've become quite the figure, you know. Young woman under the Duke's protection, inheriting the Carter name without the Carter family. It's a singular situation. I suppose it is. One wonders, Ferris said, still in that conversational tone, still looking at the garden, what exactly the arrangement involves. practically speaking. The Duke is not known for philanthropic motivations. Evelyn felt the sentence land and chose, deliberately, not to respond to it immediately. She counted 2 breaths. She looked at the garden. She picked apart the sentence carefully, the way Adrian had once told her to pick apart anything that felt like a trap. Find the weight first, then find where it's attached. Lord Ferris, she said, that's an interesting approach to conversation. He looked at her then. Something in her tone had surprised him. I've been in English high society for 12 years, she continued, her voice pleasant, quiet, carrying exactly to him and no further. I've heard every version of that implication. You're not especially original, but I'll give you points for directness. She smiled at him, the particular smile she had learned from watching Adrian manage people. Just enough warmth to be unreadable. The arrangement, as you call it, involves the Duke honoring a legal guardianship he undertook when I was 10 years old. That's the practical answer. If there's a different answer you were fishing for, I'd encourage you to find a better fishing ground. Ferris stared at her for a long moment. Sharp girl, he said finally. Something shifted in his face. Not quite respect. Something more calculating than respect. A reassessment. Your father was sharp too. A pause with something underneath it that she couldn't immediately classify. Pity how things ended for him. The sentence dropped into the conversation like something that had been thrown with specific intent, and Evelyn felt it. A hook, a barb, something with a specific weight she couldn't quite account for. Pity how things ended, not a condolence. Something else. Something that knew more than it was saying. Excuse me, she said. She moved away from the east doors, through the crowd, toward the terrace, and the October air hit her face like cold water. She stood at the stone railing and breathed and let herself do what she almost never allowed herself to do in public. She let herself feel something clearly, without the management layer. Her parents had died in a carriage accident when she was 10. The inquiry had found nothing suspicious. Adrian had attended to every detail of the estate, had maintained her inheritance with a precision that had protected her through every legal challenge, had raised her inside Blackthorn Manor with the careful distance of a man who understood that a child needed structure and safety more than warmth, and had provided both, though the warmth came in its own language. Pity how things ended. Why did that sound like something it wasn't supposed to sound like? You're outside. Adrian's voice came from the terrace door, observant. She didn't turn around. He came to stand beside her at the railing. He did not ask what was wrong. Adrian Blackthorn had never asked her what was wrong. He simply appeared in the proximity of wrong and waited, which was either deeply perceptive or deeply exasperating depending on her mood. Ferris said something, she said. A pause. I know, I was watching. You couldn't have heard him from across the room. No, but I could see your face. She finally turned to look at him. The October night had done something to the party noise, muffled it, softened the edges. Up here on the terrace, it was just the two of them, and the city lights and the cold. And she was struck, not for the first time, but more sharply than usual, by the particular strangeness of him, this man who terrified an entire kingdom, standing next to her in the dark, asking nothing, simply present with an absoluteness that she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing what it meant. He said it was a pity how things ended for my father, she said. And it didn't sound like sympathy. Something happened in Adrian's face, brief, controlled, but she was watching for it and she caught the edge of it. Not surprised, not quite. Something more like a calculation reaching a new variable. What did it sound like, he said, and his voice was very careful, in the way it was careful when he was managing something significant. It sounded, she said slowly, like he knew something about how they ended. She looked at him. Adrian. Evelyn. Is there something about my parents' deaths that I don't know? The question she had never asked before, not in 12 years, not in 12 years of trusting him without asking. It sat between them now in the cold October air. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the city lights beyond the garden. And she watched him. Watched the man she had known for 12 years. The man she had called brother. The man she had followed through years of not quite understanding. And she waited. He turned to look at her. And in his eyes, in the gray-green depths that she had spent 12 years learning to read and still could not fully translate, she saw something that turned the temperature of the night several degrees colder. There are things, he said, that I have been waiting for the right time to tell you. The party noise from inside the ballroom rose and fell. Someone laughed at something, the sound bright and meaningless. How long, she said, have you been waiting? He did not answer immediately. The pause carried its own information. Adrian. Her voice had changed. She heard it herself, the careful steadiness she maintained in social situations, stripped. Just her voice, just the question, just 12 years of trust pressed into 3 syllables of his name. How long have you been waiting? Since the beginning, he said. And in the silence that followed, with the city spread out below them and the party burning bright and oblivious behind the glass, Evelyn understood with the particular certainty of suddenly correct mathematics that she had fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of the last 12 years, that what she had been living inside was not the shape she had believed it to be, and that the man standing next to her had known that for every single day of the time she had spent calling him brother. Before she could speak, before she could form the question that was assembling itself from the wreckage of her assumptions, the terrace doors burst open, and Lord Harwick's personal footman, white-faced and breathing wrong, looked directly at Adrian with the expression of a man delivering information he desperately wished he did not possess. Your Grace, the man's voice shook. There is an incident in the East Wing. The documents. He stopped, looked at Evelyn, looked back at Adrian. Say it, Adrian said. The Carter family documents, the footman said. Someone has broken into the archive room, the sealed records from the original inquiry. A pause. They've been taken, all of them, every piece of evidence that the investigation ever. Adrian was already moving, and in the split second before he went through the terrace doors, he turned back to Evelyn with an expression she had never seen on his face in 12 years. Not rage, not coldness, but something raw and specific and directed entirely at her, something that looked, in the brief terrible moment before he controlled it, like the face of a man who had spent 12 years protecting a truth from a woman who was now, finally, close enough to find it herself. Stay here, he said. The doors closed behind him. Evelyn stood alone on the terrace in the October cold, and understood with the absolute clarity of a woman who had just watched 12 years of careful architecture begin to come apart at the foundation, that nothing about the rest of her life was going to look like what she had believed it to be. Somewhere below, in the east wing of Harwick Palace, someone had just stolen the documents that explained how her parents had died. And the man who had spent 12 years pretending those documents didn't matter had just run to find them. The night was not yet finished with its revelations. The footman's footsteps had barely faded down the corridor before Evelyn moved. She told herself it was instinct. The cold on the terrace, the open doors, the particular silence of a room that had just been vacated by the only person whose presence organized her sense of direction. She told herself it was simply the physical logic of being alone in the dark and following the only available light. She told herself many things in the 30 seconds it took her to cross the terrace and push through the doors Adrian had just exited through, and none of them were the truth, and some part of her knew it. The east wing of Harwick Palace was a different country from the ballroom. The party's sound died within 20 feet of the connecting corridor, muffled first, then absent, replaced by the specific silence of old stone and closed doors, and the distant murmur of people who understood that something had gone wrong and were choosing, with the social self-preservation instinct of the English aristocracy, to not be near it. 2 footmen stood at the corridor intersection with the stiff uncertainty of men awaiting instructions. They looked at Evelyn, and then, with the particular reflex she had spent 12 years watching people perform, looked past her for Adrian. Miss Carter. One of them stepped forward. His Grace said, I know what he said. She kept moving. She found the archive room by following the light. The door was open. The lock had not been broken. It had been worked, which was worse, which meant someone with knowledge and time and preparation rather than desperation. The room itself was modest by the standards of Harwick's larger spaces. Shelving on 3 walls, a writing table in the center, the particular smell of old paper and wax that accumulates in rooms where documents are stored for years without being touched. Half the shelves were intact. The section against the far wall was not. Adrian stood in the center of the room with his back to the door. He was not moving. That was the first thing she registered, the absolute stillness of him, the kind that was not calm, but was instead the surface condition of something running at significant depth. His hands were at his sides. The mask he had worn for the masquerade was gone. She had not seen him remove it. On the table in front of him lay a single document. 1 page, cream-colored, heavy stock. The kind of paper that cost money and implied permanence. He had not heard her come in. Or he had heard her and was not yet ready to turn around. She looked at the empty shelves, at the systematic absence where years of filed records had been. Someone had come in here with specific knowledge of what they were looking for, not ransacking, not grabbing everything, but selecting, extracting. The remaining documents were untouched. Whatever had been taken was exactly what someone had needed. Adrian, she said. His shoulders moved, not flinching, something more controlled than that, a contained response to stimulus. He turned around. She had seen this man in a great many configurations over 12 years. She had seen him conduct negotiations that left opposing parties uncertain of what exactly had happened to them. She had seen him silence a room of 50 powerful men with a single sentence spoken at ordinary volume. She had seen him, once, at 15, hold her hair back when she was sick with fever, and then leave the room and pretend with absolute convincing precision that it had not happened. She had never seen his face look like this. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Then the control came back down like a blind over a window, and he was Adrian again, composed, precise, managing the room. But she had seen it. 3 seconds of a man who was, underneath all of it, genuinely frightened, not for himself. I told you to stay on the terrace, he said. You've been telling me things for 12 years, she said. I've been selectively complying for 12 years. This is consistent. Something moved in his jaw. This isn't the time. Whose documents were those, specifically? She looked at the empty shelves. Not the general inquiry. The specific records that were taken. What were they? He did not answer. Adrian. She crossed the room until she was close enough that he would have to either look at her or make a specific choice to look away. And she watched him choose to look at her because looking away was not something Adrian Blackthorne did. What were those documents? Evidence, he said. Of what? The single page on the table lay between them. She looked down at it. He moved, not quickly, but with intention, and his hand came down on the page before she could read it, his palm flat against the paper, his eyes on her face. Not yet, he said. That's not your decision. It is tonight. It's mine tonight. The quietness of his voice had a different quality than usual, stripped of the social management layer, the Duke performance. Just his voice, raw at the edges in a way she had not heard before. Give me until morning. That's what I'm asking. You're not asking. You're telling. I'm asking. A pause. I don't ask for things. You know that. I'm asking. She looked at his hand on the paper, at the tendons visible through the skin, the controlled pressure of a man keeping something contained that did not want to stay contained. She looked up at his face. Who took them? She said. Something behind his eyes went very still. I have a suspicion. Tell me. Evelyn? Tell me who you suspect took the evidence about how my parents died, she said, and her own voice came out harder than she expected, the edges of it unfamiliar in her own mouth. And then explain to me why there was evidence to take in the first place if the inquiry found nothing suspicious. The room held the sentence. Adrian took his hand off the paper. She looked down at it. The document was a letter, formal, dated 11 years ago, the handwriting precise and official. She read the first line and felt the floor do something unreliable under her feet. She read it again. Then she looked up at Adrian. This is a suppression order, she said. The words came out very flat, very careful. For an official inquiry. Yes. Signed by 3 lords of the Privy Council. Yes. Suppressing the findings of an investigation into my parents' deaths. Her voice had gone somewhere quiet and very still, the way rooms go quiet before weather. This is what someone didn't want found. That's why they came for it tonight. Someone knew I had it. Someone knew that keeping you close meant the risk of you eventually. He stopped. Started differently. They've been watching to see when you'd be old enough to claim the estate fully and challenge the legal transfer of your family's trade interests. Tonight was an opportunity. The masquerade, the crowd, the chaos of a large event. They used it. Who? Not a question. A demand. Ferris, and 2 others whose names I will give you when I'm certain. Edmund Ferris. Pity how things ended for your father. The sentence assembled itself retrospectively with a precision that was physically nauseating. He was there tonight deliberately. Yes. He was watching to see what you knew. When you held your own against him, he sent someone to the archive. I was testing me. She felt something cold settle across her chest. And I passed his test, so he panicked and sent someone for the documents. You passed his test, Adrian said, and there was something in the way he said it. a quality she couldn't immediately place, something that sat in the space between pride and pain. Yes, she picked up the letter. Read it through completely this time, her mind running over each sentence with the focused precision that came from being raised by a man who treated information as the only reliable currency. The suppression order covered 3 specific findings. The language was bureaucratic, formal, designed to be boring, designed to disappear into the stacks of official paperwork that accumulated in archive rooms and were never opened. But she had spent 12 years watching Adrian read the subtext of formal language, and she could read it now. The carriage had not failed mechanically. The carriage had been made to fail. She set the document down. "How long have you known?" she said. Adrian looked at her without flinching. "Since 6 months after it happened." 6 months. She was 10 years old, 6 months after her parents died. She had been living in Blackthorn Manor for 4 of those months, still calling him Brother Adrian, still waking up sometimes at night, not entirely certain she was safe, still learning the geography of a new house that was too large and too cold, and occupied by a man who terrified everyone except her. 6 months after her parents were murdered, because that was the word now, that was the correct word, and she was going to hold it correctly. Adrian Blackthorn had found out the truth and had decided, at 26 years old, to carry it alone, for 12 years, while raising the daughter of the people who had been killed, while hunting the men responsible. She understood, standing in the wrecked archive room in Harwick Palace with a suppression order in her hand, that she needed to feel this correctly. Not right now, not in the next 5 minutes, but eventually. She needed to feel the full weight of 12 years of a man choosing, over and over, every single day, to protect her from a truth while simultaneously moving toward justice for that truth. She understood that there was something in that choice that was enormous, and that it contained things she was not yet ready to categorize. But right now there was a specific problem. "They took the evidence," she said, "the copies. Whatever documents confirm the 3 lords' involvement, they're gone. There are other copies." She looked up at him. "You kept copies. I keep copies of everything." The flatness of it, the absolute matter-of-fact certainty, was so completely Adrian that she felt something crack in her chest that was not entirely grief. "They took what I allowed to be in an archive they knew about. The original documentation is elsewhere." "Then why does it matter that they took these?" "Because now they know I have what I have," he said. "Tonight was them testing the perimeter. Now they know the perimeter exists and that I've been building it for 11 years. Which means they'll stop testing and start acting." The sentence landed with its full weight. "How soon?" she said. "Days. Possibly less." From down the corridor there were voices. Harwick's men. The distant organized murmur of a large house managing an incident. Time was compressing. She could feel it. "We can't stay here," she said. "No." "Blackthorn Manor." "Yes." He was already moving toward the door, the document folded and inside his jacket with a speed that confirmed he had been prepared for this moment, had thought through the logistics of it well before tonight. He stopped at the door and turned back to her. "Evelyn." She looked at him. In the doorway, with the corridor light cutting harsh angles across his face, she could see him. She could see him clearly in a way that 12 years of proximity had somehow obscured, the way you could not see the size of a room when you were standing in its center. Adrian Blackthorn, at 38, carrying 11 years of a secret that was not his to carry, standing in the doorway of a broken archive with a face that was asking her something it was not putting into words. "I know you have questions," he said. I know there's no clean version of this to give you." "There isn't," she agreed. "When we're somewhere safe, when I can show you everything." A pause. "I will tell you all of it, without managing it." She studied him. The last sentence, "without managing it," cost him something. She could see the cost of it. Adrian managing things was his primary language, the mechanism through which he moved through the world. Offering not to manage was, from him, a significant concession. "All right," she said. Something moved in his face. Brief, genuine. They moved through the corridor, through the controlled chaos of Harwick's East Wing, through the reconvergence with the party crowd that had begun to notice something was wrong and was milling in the way of people who wanted information but not involvement. Adrian moved through all of it without stopping, with the particular quality of a man in motion who has decided that everything not directly ahead of him is irrelevant, and she moved with him, and she was aware, with a clarity that the evening's revelations had made impossible to continue avoiding, that this was what she had been doing for 12 years, moving with him, matching his pace, fitting herself into the shape of his forward motion with the ease of something practiced into reflex. The carriages were called. The night outside Harwick Palace was cold and absolutely clear, the kind of London sky that appeared occasionally in October like a promise of something. She stood on the steps while Adrian spoke in low tones to his driver, and Edmund Ferris materialized at the edge of the gathered carriages with the timing of a man who had been waiting. He was 20 feet away. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had just discovered that his test had revealed more than he intended, and that the asset he had underestimated was standing in the cold London night with an expression he did not understand and could not predict. He had expected fear, she understood. He had expected the face of a sheltered young woman discovering, for the first time, that the world was not what she'd believed it to be. He got something else entirely. She held his gaze. She held it for a full 5 seconds, which in the social mathematics of this kind of moment was not a duration. It was a declaration. Ferris was 63 years old and had spent 63 years living in a world where the kind of look a young woman gave a man across a driveway meant nothing that he needed to concern himself with. She watched him recalibrate. Then Adrian appeared at her shoulder, and Ferris looked away. The carriage moved. The city passed the windows in the late-night configuration of lights and dark buildings, and the occasional figure moving through gas lamp pools. Evelyn sat across from Adrian and said nothing for the first several minutes, and he said nothing, and the silence between them had a different shape than their usual silence, charged in a new way, all its familiar architecture rearranged by the last 3 hours. "He'll move fast," she said. "Yes, he knows I know, and he knows you have copies he didn't find." She looked out the window. "He's going to try to discredit us before you can use them, before I can file a formal petition for the original inquiry to be reopened." Adrian looked at her. "I can file a petition," she said. "I'm 22. The estate is legally mine. I have standing to challenge the original inquiry findings." She turned from the window. "With your copies as evidence and the suppression order they now have. The suppression order that you watched me read, that I can testify to, its contents, the signatures." She met his eyes. "I read it once, and I remember everything on it. You know I remember everything." A long pause. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know." "Then we have a case. We have the beginning of one. Filing the petition makes us visible targets. It moves the conflict from passive to active." He looked at her steadily. "Once we file, there's no position we can retreat to. They will use everything available to them, social, legal, political. They will go after your reputation. They will construct a narrative. They already have one," she said. "The young woman seducing the Duke for position. I've been living inside that narrative for years." Something in her voice hardened with a clarity that felt for the first time like choice rather than survival. "I'd rather give them something worth talking about." The carriage moved through the dark London streets, carrying them toward the long straight road north out of the city, toward Blackthorn Manor, toward whatever the morning would bring. Neither of them spoke for another mile. "There's something else," Adrian said. She waited. Ferris was not acting alone tonight. The operation, the archive breach, the level of access, the timing, that requires coordination above Ferris's capability. There's someone organizing above him. He paused. The pauses with Adrian always carried their own information. Someone with access to the Privy Council's current membership. Someone who knew we would both be at Harwick tonight. The carriage hit a rough section of road. The lamp swung. Shadows moved across his face. "Prince Leonard," she said. Not a guess. The way his jaw set at the name confirmed it without any additional word required. She had met Prince Leonard twice, formal court occasions, his attention brief and evaluative in the way of a man who was assessing commodities rather than people. The Duke's political rival, the man who occupied the precise intersection of power and ambition that made him simultaneously Adrian's most significant enemy and the most dangerous kind of untouchable. "He's been behind it," she said, "the original suppression, the protection of Ferris and the others." "From the beginning," Adrian said. "Your father's trade empire was not simply profitable. It was positioned across 3 routes that Leonard needed controlled when he eventually made his move toward consolidating power. Your father refused him twice. The third approach was the carriage. 11 years. 11 years of knowing this and staying silent and raising the dead man's daughter and hunting the edges of what could be proven and what could not be proven and watching Leonard remain untouchable because touching him required evidence that would hold against the weight of royal protection. She understood, with a completeness that settled into her bones, what the last 11 years had actually been. Not guardianship, not charity, not even purely protection. Preparation. He had been preparing her. Every lesson in reading documentation, every dinner where he corrected her political analysis, every time he had put her in a room with powerful men and watched from across the room as she navigated it, his face neutral, his attention total. She had thought he was teaching her to survive in the world she occupied. He had been teaching her to survive a war she didn't yet know she was in. She looked at him across the dark carriage interior. This man who had spent 11 years building a case and building a weapon and had never, not once, indicated to her that the weapon was herself. "When were you going to tell me?" she said. "If Ferris hadn't moved tonight, if I hadn't pushed you on the terrace." When? The city lights had thinned, countryside now, dark fields, the road stretching north. "When you were ready," he said. "How would you have known when I was ready?" "I would have known." "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have." His voice was quiet in the way of something stripped of its usual architecture, operating on different foundations. "I've made decisions about your life that weren't mine to make. I know that. I've known it for years, and I've made them anyway, because the alternative was—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "The alternative was leaving you unprotected in a situation you didn't understand, and that wasn't something I was able to choose. You enable, not unwilling." She caught that and held it. "Adrian." She kept her voice steady over the lurching in her chest. "Whatever you have planned for after we file that petition, whatever the endgame looks like when you bring down Leonard—" "We bring down Leonard," he said. She looked at him. "You said we have a case," he said. "You're right, but the petition requires your signature. The testimony requires your voice. The evidence I've built for 11 years requires you standing behind it, because without the daughter of the murdered man confirming these documents' legitimacy, Leonard's lawyers take it apart in a week." The steadiness in his face had a different quality than the usual controlled surface. It was the steadiness of a man saying something he had thought about for years and was finally, irrevocably, saying aloud. "I built this case for you, to hand to you when you were ready, not to use on your behalf, to put in your hands." The carriage slowed for the manor gates. The iron gates of Blackthorn Manor appeared in the coachman's lamp glow, tall and black and permanent. Home. 12 years of it, and she was driving through them with an entirely different understanding of what home had been built on. "In the morning," she said, "you'll show me everything." "Everything," he confirmed. The gates opened, the carriage rolled through, and from the dark upper window of the manor's east wing, a light burned that had not been burning when they left that evening. Adrian saw it. She saw him see it. His entire body made a particular change that she had never seen before in 12 years. Not anger, not assessment, but the response of a man who has just discovered that the perimeter he built has already been breached. "Stay in the carriage," he said. She did not stay in the carriage. She was 3 steps behind him when he went through the front doors of Blackthorn Manor, and 2 steps behind him when he stopped dead in the entrance hall, and directly beside him when she saw what had stopped him. A man sat in the carved chair at the foot of the main staircase, relaxed as if he had been there for hours, dressed in clothes expensive enough to indicate that he had come prepared for this to be remembered. Prince Leonard looked up from the document in his hands. A document she recognized, with the sick precision of a mind that retained what it read, as a detailed account of 11 years of the Duke of Blackthorn's extrajudicial operations, his evidence building, his protection of Evelyn Carter. Every name, every move, every piece of it. He smiled at Adrian with the smile of a man holding a weapon he'd spent years waiting to use. "Your Grace," he said pleasantly. "Miss Carter." His eyes moved to her with something in them that made the hairs rise on her forearms. "I've been waiting for you both. We have a great deal to discuss." He looked down at the document in his hands. "Or rather, you have a great deal to explain." The entrance hall of Blackthorn Manor, with its 12-foot ceilings and stone floors, and the weight of the Duke's name in every surface, felt suddenly impossibly small. Adrian did not move, did not speak. He was a man who had just watched 11 years of careful, patient construction arrive at its crisis point 6 hours ahead of when he had planned for it, and she could see him. She could see him choosing, in real time, which version of Adrian Blackthorne this moment required. And she realized, standing in the entrance hall of the house she had lived in for 12 years, that she was past the point of being protected from this. She stepped forward, and the air in the entrance hall changed the way air changes before lightning. Not the strike itself, but the particular pressure that precedes it, the atmospheric acknowledgement that something irreversible is about to happen. Prince Leonard watched her cross the marble floor with the expression of a man recalibrating in real time. He had expected Adrian to speak first. He had arranged himself in that chair, in this house, with that document, for a specific confrontation. One man with power facing another man whose power was about to be systematically dismantled. Evelyn stepping into the foreground of that confrontation was not a variable he had weighted. That document, she said, belongs to the Duke of Blackthorne. Leonard looked at her. I was 41, the kind of handsome that came from generations of curated breeding and absolute confidence in one's own importance. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that looked intelligent and were mostly just careful. Miss Carter, I understand this must be disorienting. How did you get into this house? He smiled. A house has many doors. A house has staff, she said, every member of which was vetted by the Duke personally, which means someone on that staff let you in. She kept her voice flat, kept the temperature of it below what she was actually feeling, the way she had watched Adrian keep his voice below his actual temperature for 12 years. Which means tonight was coordinated. The archive breach at Harwick and the access here. That's 2 simultaneous operations. You've been planning this for a while. Something moved in Leonard's expression. Recalibration sharpening into something colder. You're sharper than your reputation suggests. My reputation was designed to suggest exactly what it suggests, she said, by the Duke. Evelyn. Adrian's voice came from behind her, quiet, carrying the specific quality of a warning she chose to hear and not act on. Leonard stood. He was tall, not Adrian's height, but tall enough to use it, the kind of man who had learned early that physical space was political language. He set the document on the chair's arm with deliberate precision and looked between them with an expression that had settled into something that was not quite a smile and not quite a threat, and was, for that reason, worse than either. Let me be direct, he said. I've spent 3 years watching the Duke build a case against certain members of the Privy Council, using methods that are, at minimum, legally questionable, and at maximum, treasonous. I have documentation, comprehensive documentation, of extrajudicial operations, witness coercion, evidence obtained without warrant or Crown authority. He paused. What I'm offering is a conversation. What I'm offering is the opportunity to discuss an arrangement before this documentation reaches the appropriate parties tomorrow morning. An arrangement, Adrian said, a practical one. Leonard's eyes moved to him. You dropped the petition. You released the Carter estate's trade interests back into legitimate oversight, which, given the legal ambiguities of your guardianship, is arguably where they belong. Miss Carter continues her life without the considerable disruption that a full public inquiry would bring, and he spread his hands, the gesture of a reasonable man, lose interest in what you've been doing in the dark for 11 years. The entrance hall held the offer. Evelyn looked at the document on the chair arm. Her mind was already running through its implications. Not the content, which she could examine later, but the structure of the threat. The specific architecture of what Leonard had brought into this house tonight. He had not come with soldiers. He had not come with a warrant. He had come alone, at night, to a house he had accessed through a compromised staff member, carrying a document he was offering not to use. He was not executing a plan. He was negotiating one, which meant the plan had a weakness. You said tomorrow morning, she said. The documentation reaches the appropriate parties tomorrow morning. Leonard looked at her. Not tonight, she said. Not an hour ago. Not on the road here, tomorrow morning. She looked at the document, which means you don't have everything you need yet. The quality of Leonard's stillness changed. Brief, controlled. But she had grown up reading that particular kind of stillness. Evelyn, Adrian said, and this time it was different. Not a warning, something closer to the way he had said her name on the terrace. A recognition. He's missing something, she said. He has enough to threaten, but not enough to convict. That's why there's an offer. She looked at Leonard directly. What are you missing? Leonard picked up the document from the chair. The pleasant surface closed over his face like a shutter. This conversation is with the Duke. This conversation, she said, is with me. Because whatever you're missing is connected to the Carter estate, specifically. Or you wouldn't be here tonight. You'd have filed the documentation weeks ago when you obtained it. She felt something crystalline and cold settling into place behind her sternum, the particular sensation of a large thing becoming suddenly clear. You need my cooperation, or my silence. One or the other. You're making significant assumptions. My father kept a secondary record. The sentence came out before she had fully decided to say it, assembled from the pieces of tonight, from Ferris's face on the terrace, from the specific documents taken from the archive, from the suppression order she had read once and retained completely. Something outside the official inquiry, something that named names the suppression order couldn't cover because it was compiled before the suppression order existed. She watched his face. You've had 11 years to find it, and you haven't, which means either it's very well hidden or it's been in a location you can't access. She paused. Or both. The entrance hall was very quiet. Leonard looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Adrian. Whatever he read in Adrian's face confirmed something, because when he looked back at Evelyn, the pleasant surface had been replaced by something considerably more direct. Miss Carter, he said, you're 22 years old. You grew up in a house with a man who used you as a strategic asset without your knowledge or consent. You have spent your entire adult life as a piece in someone else's game. His voice was quiet, reasonable, carrying the particular quality of a man who believed he was being genuinely helpful. I'm offering you an exit from that game. Take the trade interests, establish your own household, live a life that isn't defined by a dead man's war and a duke's obsession. He paused. That's not a threat. That's an observation about your circumstances that I suspect, if you're as intelligent as you appear, you've already made yourself. She felt the sentence land, felt its specific construction, the targeting of every uncertainty she had walked through in the last 3 hours, the disorientation of discovered truths, the genuine complexity of her feelings about what Adrian had and hadn't told her. Leonard had done his research. He knew where the cracks were. She looked at Adrian. I was looking at Leonard. His jaw was set in the way it was set when he was making a specific kind of decision. There was something in his face she had not seen before. Not the controlled surface, not the Duke performance, but beneath it, the raw material of a man who had built 11 years of careful architecture and was watching it be used as a lever against the one person he had built it to protect. She understood something then. She understood it with the completeness of something that had been assembling for 12 years and was now, finally, whole. His silence, all of it, the distance, the management, the careful teaching wrapped in coldness. It was not strategy, and it was not cruelty, and it was not the obsession Leonard was calling it. It was a man who had decided that what he felt was an irrelevant variable in a situation that required clarity, and who had been paying the cost of that decision every single day, and who had continued paying it because the alternative was putting her in the crosshairs of something she didn't yet have the tools to survive. She turned back to Leonard. I need a moment, she said, with the Duke, privately. Leonard raised an eyebrow. Miss Carter, you've been in this house for however long it took you to ride from Harwick. You can wait 10 more minutes in whichever room you used to enter. She met his eyes without flinching. Unless the offer has an expiration measured in minutes, rather than until morning, in which case you should say so directly. A pause. Then Leonard nodded once. The nod of a man choosing patience, because patience was currently the tactically correct choice, and moved toward the corridor. 10 minutes, he said. 10 minutes, she confirmed. She waited until the corridor swallowed him. Then she turned to Adrian. I was looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for yet, something that existed in the space between every version of him she had seen over 12 years and some version of him that had apparently been there the entire time, waiting for exactly this room, exactly this moment. The secondary record, he said. You guessed. I extrapolated. She kept her voice low. Is there one? Yes. Where? Safe. He paused. Your father gave it to me the week before he died. He said he was concerned about certain approaches he had been receiving, and that if anything happened, I would know what to do with it. She felt the breath move out of her slowly. He knew something was coming. He suspected. He wasn't certain enough to act. Adrian's voice was very quiet. I was 26. I didn't understand what he was handing me until 6 months later when I found the suppression order. She looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to look at him in years, because looking at Adrian Blackthorne clearly and directly was a thing she had instinctively understood, required preparation she hadn't previously been ready for. Is everything Leonard said true? She said. The extrajudicial operations, the methods. A pause that was itself an answer. Yes. All of it. Most of it. Some of it is constructed around true facts to suggest conclusions that aren't accurate. But the base of it? His jaw tightened. Yes. So if he files it, I face a Privy Council inquiry, possibly charges. He looked at her steadily, which is why he expects me to take the arrangement. Will you? The question sat between them. She watched him consider it, watched him actually consider it, which meant it was not a simple no, which meant there was a calculation running that involved her in a way he was still managing even now, even in this room with all the architecture dismantled. Tell me the truth, she said. Don't manage it. His eyes moved to her face. If I take the arrangement, you're safe. Your inheritance is protected. Not fully, but enough. Leonard gets what he wants and leaves you alone because you're no longer useful as leverage. A pause. If I don't take it, we go to war with a member of the royal family, using evidence that may not hold and methods that will be used to discredit everything we've built. Tell me the rest of it. That is, tell me the part where you're not safe, she said. If you take the arrangement, what happens to you? The silence was very specific. Adrian. The documentation he has, he said carefully, is sufficient to end my position, my titles, possibly my freedom, depending on how the inquiry is managed. He held her gaze. That's not a reason to take the arrangement. You were going to take it, she said, for me. I was considering you were going to let him destroy you, she said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that surprised her. That surprised him too. She could see it in the slight movement of his face. In exchange for my safety. That was what you were calculating when I asked you to wait. He did not deny it. The entrance hall was very quiet. Somewhere in the manor, a clock measured out seconds. She had spent 12 years building a careful internal architecture around this man, around what he was and was not to her, around the deliberately maintained distances, around the comfortable geography of guardian and ward and the name she had called him, that he had eventually stopped correcting. She had built that architecture because it was safe, and because it was stable, and because the alternative, the thing she had been not looking at for years, with the determined focus of someone who knows exactly what they're not looking at, was large and complicated and required a courage she had not been ready for. She thought she might be ready now. I found my father's secondary record, she said. Adrian went very still. I didn't find it physically. I found it in the suppression order. She held his gaze. The 3 signatures, Ferris, 2 others, but the suppression order references a 4th finding that was redacted, not covered, not destroyed, redacted, which means whoever drafted the order was protecting someone by excising them from the official record rather than suppressing the evidence outright. Someone who couldn't afford to have their name on a suppression order because the suppression order itself would eventually be found. She watched his face. Someone with more to lose than Ferris, someone at the level where even a suppression order is a risk. Evelyn, Leonard didn't draft the suppression order, she said. He was 29 when my parents died, not yet in the position to direct a Privy Council action. She watched him very carefully. But someone did. Someone at the level of the Crown. Someone whose name being on the original investigation would have been more damaging than the suppression itself. She paused. That's what my father's secondary record contains. Not Ferris? Not Leonard. The person above Leonard. Adrian said nothing. That's what Leonard is actually trying to protect, she said. Not himself. Someone above him, someone who can't be touched if the secondary record surfaces. She looked at him. You know who it is. The clock in the corridor measured out 3 more seconds. Yes, Adrian said. The single syllable landed in the entrance hall of Blackthorn Manor and changed the temperature of every plan Evelyn had been assembling in the last hour. Because Adrian's voice, saying that word, had the quality of a man confirming something that made the war they were about to fight significantly larger and significantly more dangerous than she had understood it to be 40 seconds ago. Before she could form the next question, there was a sound from the east corridor. Not Leonard returning, something different. Multiple footsteps. the specific cadence of men moving with purpose rather than service. She counted 4, possibly 5, before the corridor doors opened. The men who came through them were not Leonard's personal staff. They wore the particular configuration of official dress that meant crown authority, and the man leading them carried a document with a seal she recognized from enough formal occasions to place immediately. A warrant. Not for Adrian, for her. The official stepped forward with the practiced neutrality of a man executing instructions he had not authored. Miss Evelyn Carter, by authority of the Privy Council, you are requested to accompany us for questioning regarding irregularities in the original administration of the Carter estate and the legality of the guardianship arrangement established 11 years prior. Leonard appeared in the corridor behind them. His face had reorganized into something that was finally entirely honest. Not the pleasant performance, not the reasonable offer. Just a man who had been 2 steps ahead all evening and was now showing it. I apologize for the abruptness, he said, with no sincerity whatsoever. But your 10 minutes expired. Adrian moved. 1 step forward, 1, controlled, deliberate. And the officials instinctively repositioned, the way people repositioned around Adrian Blackthorne when he decided to occupy space with intention. His voice, when he spoke, was the voice she had always known. Quiet, absolute. The voice of a man for whom volume was unnecessary because certainty was sufficient. You touch her, he said, and every document in my possession regarding your operations for the last 11 years reaches every member of the House of Lords before morning. Leonard looked at him. You're bluffing. I've spent 11 years not bluffing, Adrian said. Ask Ferris how the last 3 of his operations concluded. Ask Whitmore what happened to the shipping contract he tried to route through Carter territory in 1849. Ask anyone who has tested the edge of what I will and will not do. A pause. I don't bluff. The entrance hall held itself. Evelyn looked at Adrian, at the officials, at Leonard's face, where the calculation was running visibly, pressing against the performance. She looked at the warrant in the official's hand. She thought about the shape of the next hours. The questioning, the separation from Adrian, the legal architecture Leonard had spent months building that was designed specifically to isolate the one variable he couldn't control while he dealt with the other. She understood the play. She understood it with the clarity of 12 years of education at the hands of a man who saw strategic structure the way some people saw weather, everywhere, always, informing everything. She also understood that Adrian was going to destroy himself trying to stop it. She thought about what her father had handed to a 26-year-old man the week before he died. She thought about what it cost to carry something like that for 11 years. She thought about a man standing at a window in Harwick Palace, hands behind his back, saying since the beginning. She thought about the person above Leonard. The name Adrian knew, and she didn't yet. She thought about what a 22-year-old woman with full legal standing over a significant estate and a memorized suppression order, and a testimony that had not yet been given could do if the person trying to silence her made the mistake of putting her somewhere official, somewhere public, somewhere with witnesses. She looked at Leonard. I'll go, she said. Evelyn. Adrian's voice, raw in a way it had never been in 12 years, the control fully off, just his voice. No. I'll go, she said again, and she was looking at Leonard as she said it, and she kept her face completely, deliberately, calculatingly neutral. On one condition. Leonard raised an eyebrow. I want the name, she said. Not tomorrow. Not in a questioning room. Now. The name of the person whose involvement my father documented. Say the name, and I'll walk out that door without the Duke following, and we can conduct your questioning however you need to conduct it. The entrance hall was absolutely silent. Leonard looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent the evening underestimating something and was arriving, too late, at the correct assessment. You don't need me to say it, he said slowly. You already know. She didn't know, but she held his eyes without moving, without breathing visibly, without any of the indicators that would confirm to a man of his intelligence that she was, for the first time this evening, reaching beyond what she actually had. And in the 3 seconds that Leonard looked at her, looking for the tell, looking for the edge of the bluff, she saw it in his face, the name she didn't have, the person he was protecting, the architecture of 11 years of buried truth converging in his expression in the moment before he controlled it. She had it, and she understood with the cold, absolute clarity of a woman who had just crossed a line she could not return from, that nothing, not the warrant, not the questioning, not whatever Leonard had spent months building, was going to end the way he had planned. But she also understood, as the officials moved forward and Adrian's hand closed around her arm with a force that was not control but its opposite, that the person above Leonard was someone whose destruction was going to require a sacrifice she had not yet accounted for, and that the sacrifice, when it came, was going to have Adrian Blackthorne's name on it. Adrian's hand released her arm, not because he chose to, because she looked at him directly, with full intention, with the specific quality of someone who needed him to understand something without the time or safety to say it aloud. And he read it. That was the thing about 12 years. The communication that lived below language, the understanding built from thousands of small moments of being in the same room with someone until their silences had grammar. He let go. She walked toward the officials with her chin level and her hands still, and the secondary record's contents running through her mind like a current she was learning to navigate in real time. The name she had read in Leonard's face, the architecture of the thing she was walking into. Leonard watched her cross the entrance hall with the expression of a man who had won and knew it and was. She caught this, filed it, used it, not entirely comfortable with how cleanly it had worked. A man completely confident in his victory did not watch it this carefully. The officials flanked her. The manor doors opened. October cold came in from outside. She did not look back at Adrian. She could feel him standing there, could feel the specific quality of his stillness, not the controlled stillness of the Duke in a negotiation, but the stillness of a man exerting every available resource to not move, because moving meant destroying the only calculation that had a viable outcome. She had given him no choice. She had walked into this deliberately. He understood that. Understanding it did not make it survivable for him. She knew that too. The carriage door closed and the London streets came back around her, colder now, the pre-dawn darkness having its own specific quality, thinner, harder, the night having spent its drama and settling into something rawer. Two of Leonard's men sat across from her. Neither spoke. Neither looked directly at her. The practiced professional blankness of men doing a job they preferred not to examine closely. She sat with her hands folded and her mind running. The name in Leonard's face had been Lord Regent Ashford, Edmund Ashford, the king's primary advisor, the man who had managed the crown's domestic operations for 15 years with the quiet, comprehensive authority of someone who understood that real power lived not in the visible seat but in the chair beside it. Ashford, whose family held the northern trade routes that the Carter Empire had been blocking by simply existing. Ashford, who was 67 years old and had never once appeared in a public scandal, because men like Ashford did not appear in scandals. They authored them from a sufficient distance. Her father had known Ashford's name, had documented it, had handed that documentation to a 26-year-old duke, and then died in a carriage that had been made to fail. She breathed steadily and let herself feel the grief of that correctly. Not now, not in this carriage, but she acknowledged it. Let it move through her once, and then set it somewhere she could return to. Right now there was a specific problem with a specific solution that required her to be completely clear. They took her to a building she recognized as one of the Privy Council's administrative offices, rather than any kind of holding facility, which confirmed what she had suspected. Leonard wanted questioning, not imprisonment. Imprisonment created legal obligations and public records. Questioning in the early morning hours in an unofficial capacity was a pressure tactic, not an action. He wanted her disoriented and isolated and managed, not actually detained because an actual detention required justification he did not yet have. She filed that. The room they put her in was well appointed in the way that rooms used for official purposes in England were well appointed. Quality furniture that communicated seriousness without comfort. A fire that had been lit recently and was doing adequate work. A window overlooking a courtyard that was currently occupied by three men she didn't recognize doing nothing in the organized way of men who were positioned rather than present. The officials left. A different man entered. I was 50-something, gray at the temples, carrying a document case with the air of a man who had conducted this kind of conversation before and found it professionally routine. He introduced himself as Counselor Brent, set the document case on the table without opening it, and looked at her with the particular neutral assessment of a man whose job required forming accurate impressions quickly. "Miss Carter," he said, "thank you for coming." "I didn't come willingly," she said. "Let's not begin with inaccuracies. It wastes time and I don't have patience for it." Brent looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, something more professional than that. Recognition. You've been raised by the Duke. I've been educated by him, she said. There's a distinction. What are the specific irregularities the council wishes to question me about? He opened the document case. The next hour was, in the technical sense, an interrogation, structured, methodical, designed to establish inconsistencies in her understanding of her own estate's administration. Brent was good at it. He circled, returned, rephrased. He was looking for the place where her knowledge had gaps he could use, where 12 years of Adrian's management had created legal ambiguities that could be weaponized as evidence of impropriety. He didn't find the gaps he needed, because Adrian had spent 12 years educating her in the exact architecture of her own estate, every account, every legal instrument, every decision made in her name and the reasoning behind it. She could not have articulated, before tonight, why he had insisted she understand the specific legal language of guardianship structures, or why he had made her read the original inheritance documents 3 times at 16. She understood now. He had been giving her armor she hadn't known she was going to need. She answered every question completely and precisely, and volunteered nothing. By the second hour, Brent had set his pen down twice and picked it up again. The tell of a man whose document case was not filling the way he had anticipated. The door opened. Leonard came in. No preamble, no courtesy. He was wearing different clothes than he had at Harwick. He had gone home and changed, which meant he had expected this to take longer, which meant the timeline was already shifted. He stood at the end of the table and looked at her with the face he had shown her in the Manor's entrance hall. The honest one, stripped of performance. "Where is the secondary record?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "The Duke has it." "The Duke," Leonard said, "has left Blackthorn Manor." She kept her face neutral. "Within 20 minutes of your departure," he said, "which means he's moving, which means he anticipated the next step, which means whatever he's doing right now is something you discussed in those 10 minutes. He leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "I need you to understand your actual position. You are 22 years old. You are in a room with the documentation of 11 years of extrajudicial activity by your guardian. I can construct a narrative in which you were complicit, not willingly, not even knowingly, but complicit by proximity. And that narrative will stick because the alternative narrative requires the public to believe that the Tyrant Duke spent 11 years protecting an orphaned girl out of pure altruism." His voice was even, almost gentle. "That's not a story England will believe. They'll believe the other one, and you will spend the next decade of your life managing the consequences." She looked at him. She thought about Adrian moving. Adrian with 20 minutes and 11 years of preparation, and the particular quality of a man who planned for contingencies the way other men breathed. She thought about what he would do with 20 minutes in a clear field and no obligation to protect her from his own methods. She thought about the secondary record and Ashford's name and what the shape of this looked like from the other side of the board. "You're afraid," she said. Leonard straightened slightly. "Not of the Duke," she clarified. "Of whoever you're protecting. Of what happens to you if Ashford decides you've become a liability." She watched his face. "You didn't build this operation for yourself. You've been running it for him. And now that it's in motion and the outcomes are uncertain, you're in the position of a man who is committed to a path that has one direction." She paused. "That's not a comfortable position." The room was very quiet. Brent had stopped writing entirely. Leonard looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Something that was not quite anger and not quite respect and was, underneath both, something that looked remarkably like fear. "Who told you that name?" he said. She said nothing. Outside in the London pre-dawn, the city was shifting toward morning. The light at the window had changed. Not sunrise yet, but the sky's first acknowledgement that darkness was not permanent. She watched it and thought about Adrian moving through that darkness with 11 years of built architecture and the specific recklessness of a man who had decided that a particular outcome was worth any price required to reach it. She had understood something about him tonight that she had been circling for years. A man like Adrian Blackthorn, precise, controlled, operating always from the cold architecture of strategy, became something different when the variables were wrong, when the thing he was protecting was in the wrong room, when patience ran out of road. She had seen the edge of it in the entrance hall when the officials moved toward her. She had seen what lived on the other side of his control. She hoped Leonard had not made the mistake of leaving him enough room to reach it. 3 hours after she had walked into the building, The door opened again and a man entered who was not one of Leonard's. I was Adrian's solicitor, a sharp-faced man named Graves who had served the Blackthorn estate for 15 years, and who walked into the room with the particular energy of a man who had been woken at 4 in the morning, given specific instructions, and was executing them with professional precision. He carried a document case of his own. He set it on the table. He looked at Brent and then at Leonard with the assessing neutrality of someone who had walked into many rooms and immediately understood who had the weakest position. "Miss Carter," he said, "the Duke sends his regards." "Is he all right?" she said, and her voice came out with less management than she intended. Graves glanced at her. "He's presenting documentation to 3 members of the House of Lords currently," he said. "He asks that you exercise patience for approximately 40 more minutes." Leonard's jaw tightened. "What documentation?" "Lord Regent Ashford's involvement in the suppression of the Carter inquiry," Graves said, with the flat precision of a man reading a grocery list. He opened the document case. Specifically, the original directive authorizing the elimination of Thomas and Margaret Carter, the financial records connecting Ashford's family holdings to the Carter trade routes, and a sworn testimony from a surviving member of the original investigation who was, until last week, in the Duke's protective custody. He set the documents on the table in a neat stack. "There are copies already in transit to the Times, and to the Edinburgh Review, and to the private correspondence of 4 lords who have been waiting, for various reasons of their own, for an actionable opportunity to address Ashford's influence on Crown operations." The room held the silence of something structural giving way. Leonard looked at the documents on the table. He looked at them the way a man looks at the thing that ends a version of his life, with the particular suspended quality of someone who knows the impact is coming and has not yet felt it. "He can't," Leonard said. It came out quieter than he intended. "The extrajudicial—" "The Duke," Graves said, "is currently engaged in surrendering himself to the authority of Lord Harrington and Lord Cass for a formal inquiry into his methods. Voluntarily." A pause. "Which, as I understand it, eliminates the leverage you were holding. He has made the charges against himself public before you could use them as a private instrument." Evelyn felt the breath move out of her. He had surrendered himself, voluntarily, preemptively. He had taken the weapon Leonard had been holding over his head and made it public before it could be used in private, had dismantled the threat by becoming its subject openly, which meant Leonard had no leverage, which meant the documentation Graves had just set on the table could move through the system without the counterweight of the Duke's exposure neutralizing it. It was the correct move, strategically. With cold precision, it was the move that won the board. It was also, she understood with a completeness that sat behind her sternum like a physical weight, the move that would cost him everything. She stood up. "Miss Carter," Brent started. She was already at the door. The officials in the corridor moved to stop her, and she looked at them with a face she had been assembling for the last 3 hours. Not the careful management of a woman in a difficult situation, but something else. Something that had been constructing itself out of 12 years of education and 3 hours of interrogation and the specific moment she had understood what Adrian had walked out of Blackthorn Manor to do. "I am the primary petitioner in the Carter estate inquiry," she said. "I am the legal complainant whose testimony is required to substantiate every document the Duke just put into motion. If you impede my movement right now, you impede the prosecution of Lord Regent Ashford, and you will answer for that obstruction in a significantly less comfortable room than this one." She looked at the official directly. "Move." He moved. The city outside was the gray gold of English pre-dawn, the streets not yet awake, the buildings still holding their nighttime weight. She had no carriage. She walked, which was not what women in her position did at 4:40 in the morning in London, and she did not care, and the cold was real and grounding and useful. She walked with the specific focus of someone who has a destination and has reduced the world to the distance between here and there. Lord Harrington's townhouse was 12 minutes on foot. She made it in 9. The footman at the door looked at her with the expression of a man whose evening had already contained more than he had contracted for when he accepted this position. She gave him her name and watched his face confirm that it was expected, which meant Adrian had planned for this, which meant there was still architecture she was moving inside that she had not fully mapped. They put her in a sitting room. She stood. 2 minutes later, the door opened and Adrian walked in. He looked like a man who had fought 12 years of a war in a single night, and had arrived at the last hour of it, having paid every cost along the way. His jacket was gone. His shirt sleeves were pushed up. There was a cut along his jaw she had not seen before, recent, still raw, that someone had done a cursory job of managing. He walked without slowing when he saw her, crossed the room with the kind of directness that had no social layer on it at all, and stopped 2 feet in front of her with his eyes on her face like she was the only fixed point in a room that had been moving. "You walked," he said. 12 minutes. 9 if you're motivated. "You're not injured." "I'm not injured." She looked at the cut on his jaw. "You are." "It's minor." "It's not minor. It needs to be properly—" "Evelyn." His voice, saying her name, had the quality it had on the terrace at Harwick, stripped. Just the sound of him, no architecture around it. "I need you to know that the surrender was not— I made that choice knowing you would understand it as—" "I understand what it cost," she said. "It's not done yet. Harrington is managing the formal documentation, but the inquiry will take—" "Adrian!" She stopped him the way he had stopped her all her life, with the simple placement of his name in the air between them, but in her voice now. "I know what comes next. I know what the inquiry will look like, and I know what your testimony will have to include, and I know that the months ahead are going to be—" She stopped, started differently, the way he had in the archive room. "I've spent 12 years calling you something that was never accurate." The room was very quiet. I was looking at her with the face she had seen for 3 seconds in the archive room, and then again in the entrance hall, the one she didn't have a name for. The face of a man who had spent 12 years with one specific thing on the other side of a wall he had built himself. "You stopped asking me to stop," she said. "I stopped asking you things I knew you wouldn't do," he said. "Was that the only reason?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that no, it was not the only reason, and that he was choosing, for the first time, not to manage that answer into something safer. "No," he said. Somewhere in Lord Harrington's townhouse, the formal inquiry was assembling itself, documents changing hands, men in serious rooms making the decisions that would determine the shape of the next months of both their lives. Outside, the city was beginning to wake. The light at the window had shifted from gray to the particular pale gold of English morning. She reached up and touched the cut along his jaw. He went absolutely still, not the controlled stillness. The other kind, the kind she had seen 3 times tonight, the kind that lived underneath everything else. "There are things," she said, "that I'm going to need you to say to me directly, without managing them, at some point in the next several days when there's a room without crisis in it." "Yes," he said. The word came out rough at the edges. "But right now," she said, "Harrington is waiting, and Ashford's solicitors are already preparing a counterfiling, and you have 12 years of evidence to put in front of people who need to be convinced before the Crown has time to suppress it a second time." His hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his jaw. The contact was brief, deliberate, entirely without the distance that had governed 12 years of proximity. "You should not have walked out of that building," he said. "You should not have surrendered yourself without telling me first," she said. "I couldn't tell you. You would have stopped me." "Yes," she said. "I would have. That's why I didn't tell you." She looked at him. He looked at her. 12 years sat in the room between them, like weather that had finally arrived after a long season of pressure. "Come on," she said. "They're waiting." She turned toward the door. His hand caught hers. Not the grip from the entrance hall, not the practiced non-touch of 12 years of managed distance. Just his hand around hers. Holding. The simplest possible language for the most complicated possible thing. She did not pull away. They walked toward the door of the sitting room together, and on the other side of it, Lord Harrington's formal inquiry was already in motion, and Ashford's people were already making their counter-moves, and the documents were already in transit to every press organ that mattered, and the shape of the next hours was one of the most dangerous either of them had ever walked toward. And Evelyn Carter, daughter of Thomas and Margaret Carter, ward of the Duke of Blackthorn for 12 years, understood with complete clarity that the woman who walked out the other side of this would not resemble the woman who had stood on Harwick's terrace asking a man why he had kept her in the dark. That woman had been living inside someone else's architecture. What came next, she was going to build herself. The door opened. Lord Harrington looked up from his documents, looked at their joined hands with an expression he controlled in roughly 1 second, and said, "Miss Carter, we need your testimony, all of it, starting from the suppression order." She sat down across from him. "Lord Regent Ashford," she said, and watched every man in the room go very still. "I'll start there." The inquiry lasted 11 days. Not the clean, contained thing that formal proceedings were supposed to be. Not the orderly presentation of evidence and measured deliberation that the language of official process implied. It was 11 days of rooms that smelled like old paper and political fear, of men who had spent careers building insulation against exactly this kind of exposure, discovering that 11 years of a duke's patience had been more thorough than their insulation. It was 11 days of Evelyn's voice in official chambers, steady and precise, reading from memory, the contents of a suppression order she had seen once in a wrecked archive room. It was 11 days of Adrian's testimony, delivered with the flat completeness of a man who had decided that the only thing left worth doing was the truth without management. She sat through every session she was permitted to attend. She watched him speak into rooms full of men whose faces cycled through disbelief and calculation, and the particular expression of powerful people encountering something they cannot immediately contain. She watched him name every operation, every extrajudicial decision, every choice made in the dark for 11 years, with the stillness of a man who had already made his accounting with himself before he walked through the door. That was the thing about Adrian Blackthorne that none of the men in those rooms could fully process. He was not defending himself. He was not minimizing or contextualizing or performing contrition for the benefit of the panel. He was simply reporting, accurate, complete, without the protective layer that self-preservation would have added. He had walked into the inquiry the way he walked into every room, with the authority of a man who had decided what this moment required and was providing it. What it required, he had decided, was the entire truth. All of it, including the parts that cost him. Lord Regent Ashford was arrested on the 5th day, not quietly. The Times had the story before the official warrant was issued, which meant the city had it before the Crown's communication apparatus could shape the narrative, which meant the narrative shaped itself. And what it shaped was damning and comprehensive and impossible to suppress, because the suppression apparatus itself was part of what had been exposed. Edmund Ashford, 67 years old, the king's primary domestic advisor for 15 years, was taken from his townhouse on a Tuesday morning while the city watched. Evelyn heard about it from Graves, who delivered the information with the same professional flatness with which he delivered all information, and she sat with it for several minutes in the small office Lord Harrington had assigned her for the duration of the inquiry. She sat with the specific weight of it, 11 years, 2 people, a carriage on a road that had been made to fail. And she let herself feel it correctly, not as victory, as settlement, as the particular thing that happens when a debt that has been carried too long is finally, imperfectly, partially paid. She thought about her father. She thought about her mother. She thought about a man who had known the truth for 11 years and had chosen over and over and over to carry it alone rather than give her something she couldn't yet do anything with. She had been angry about that. She had walked through several phases of angry about it in the 11 days of the inquiry, processing it in the margins of official proceedings, in the brief hours of sleep, in the mornings when she stood at the window of the lodging house Harrington had arranged and watched London wake up, and thought about what it meant to be protected from a truth that was yours. She had arrived, somewhere around the 7th day, at something that was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness implied a transgression, and she was still working out the precise moral geography of what he had done, but was adjacent to it. The understanding that a 26-year-old man handed a dead friend's documented murder, and a 10-year-old child had made choices from the materials available to him. That those choices had costs she hadn't consented to bear. That they had also, demonstrably, kept her alive and capable and educated enough to walk into a room on the 4th day of an official inquiry and dismantle a 67-year-old lord's legal insulation from the inside. The truth was not clean. She was done requiring it to be clean. On the 11th day, Lord Harrington delivered the panel's findings with the gravity appropriate to a document that ended several careers and won freedom and reorganized a significant portion of the Crown's domestic advisory structure. Ferris lost his titles. 2 other lords lost theirs. Leonard faced a separate inquiry into his own operations, not the one Adrian had threatened him with in the manor, but a more thorough one, assembled from the evidence Evelyn's testimony had unlocked, that would occupy the next year of his life, and conclude in ways he had not planned for when he sat down in that carved chair. Adrian faced a formal censure and a 2-year suspension of his seat in the House of Lords. She was in the room when Harrington read it. She watched Adrian receive it, watched his face, which was the face of a man who had expected something in this range and had already made whatever peace was available to make with it. He nodded once, the nod of a man closing an account. The panel adjourned. People moved. The room organized itself into the purposeful motion of proceedings concluding. Evelyn did not move. She sat at the long table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed and let the 11 days settle into their final shape around her. Adrian sat down beside her, not across from her. Beside her, in the chair that had been occupied for 11 days by Harrington's secondary counsel, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the specific weight of his presence that she had spent 12 years learning the texture of without ever, until recently, acknowledging what that familiarity meant. 2 years, she said. Yes. It could have been worse. Yes. She looked at the table. At the documents spread across it, the official residue of 11 days of dismantling. Harrington was fair. Harrington wanted Ashford, Adrian said. He's wanted him for 6 years and didn't have what he needed. We gave him what he needed. The censure is the price of the accommodation. You knew he'd manage it that way. I hoped. A pause. I was not certain. She turned to look at him. The light in Harrington's formal chamber was the heavy gray of November now, the window showing a sky that had decided on clouds for the foreseeable future. In that light, at the end of 11 days that had cost both of them in different ways, she could see the evidence of the cost in his face. Not age exactly, but a kind of settledness that had not been there before. As if the machinery of the last 11 years had finally been allowed to stop running and his body was learning what that felt like. There was a cut, almost fully healed now, along his jaw. You need to tell me, she said, what the next 2 years look like, practically. The estate management passes to an appointed steward for the duration. My legal operations continue. The censure affects the Lord's seat, not the title or the holdings. He paused. It's manageable. And the Carter estate, yours, fully. The original legal transfer is reinstated and the trade interests revert with back compensation for the 11 years of diverted revenue. He said it with the flat precision of a man reporting a financial outcome, but she could hear underneath the precision the specific quality of someone telling her something they had spent 11 years working to be able to say. It's yours, Evelyn, all of it, what your father built. She looked at the table again. She thought about what her father had built, the scope of it, the trade routes, the legal structure, the employees and contracts and relationships that constituted a significant commercial empire. She thought about herself at 22, in possession of something that large. I'm going to need help administering it, she said. You have competent people. I've been maintaining relationships with the key. I know, she said. I meant from you. Silence. She turned to look at him again and found him looking at her with that expression, the one she had spent 12 years not looking at directly. The one she had finally learned to hold his gaze through. The suspension doesn't prohibit consulting, she said. And you know the estate structure better than anyone living. She paused. I'm not asking you to manage it. I'm asking you to advise. On my terms. When I ask. On your terms, he repeated. That's a new arrangement, she said. That's the arrangement going forward if there is one. He looked at her for a long moment. The room was nearly empty now. Clerks gathering documents, a servant banking the fire, just the two of them, and the residue of 11 days and 12 years, and everything that had accumulated in the space between those two measurements. There's something I need to say to you, he said, that I've been... He stopped. The stop was not uncertainty. It was the stop of a man choosing his words with the precision he gave to everything, but without the management layer, without the architectural control. Raw at the edges. I handled the last 12 years from a position of another stop, and this one had something in it she recognized as cost, as the specific effort of a man trained to precision, forcing himself through imprecision, because imprecision was what the truth required here. I made you into a strategy. That wasn't, even with the reasons, even with everything that justified it, that wasn't what you deserved. The room was very quiet. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to... I know, she said again, not cutting him off, just placing the words in the space where he was going, gently. And I don't need the accounting right now. I've done my own version of it in the last 11 days, and I know what the numbers look like. She looked at her hands on the table. You made choices from what you had. Some of them cost me things I should have been given. Some of them cost you things no one should have to carry. She looked up. I know both of those things are true at the same time. I've stopped trying to make them into a single thing. He looked at her with an expression she finally had a name for. She had been building the name for it for 11 days in the margins of official proceedings, assembling it from every component of 12 years of history. It was the expression of a man who had decided very long ago that certain things were not available to him, not as punishment, not as choice exactly, but as the structural consequence of what he had decided to be and do and carry. And who was now in the presence of evidence that he had been wrong about that the wall he had built had been both necessary and incorrect, that the cost had been real, and the thing on the other side of it had survived the cost and was sitting 3 feet from him in a chair in Harrington's formal chamber, telling him that both things could be true at the same time. Evelyn, he said. Say it directly, she said. You promised me. No management. The pause was the longest he had given her since the terrace at Harwick. Outside, London moved through its gray November morning, indifferent to the specific architecture of this room, this table, these two people arriving at the end of something that had taken 12 years to travel. I have loved you, he said, for longer than it was appropriate to love you. I made decisions based on that fact that I would not have made otherwise. Some of those decisions were right, and some of them were wrong, and I have been living with that accounting for years. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who has decided that flinching now, after everything, would be a specific kind of cowardice. I am not asking you to feel what I feel. I am not presenting it as something that requires a response. I am saying it because you asked me to say things directly, and this is the most direct thing I have. The fire crackled. A clerk at the far end of the room pretended to be occupied with documents. She looked at Adrian Blackthorne. At 38, at the end of 11 days that had stripped every performance layer from both of them, at the man who had been the architecture of her world for 12 years, and who was sitting in a chair next to her without the architecture, just himself, just the raw material of a person who had paid an enormous cost for a choice he had never quite allowed himself to name aloud until now. She thought about the 10-year-old girl who had called him Brother Adrian with the guileless confidence of a child who needed the world to have stable architecture. She thought about what he had been carrying in those early years when she called him that and he let her. The particular discipline of a man who had decided that what he felt was irrelevant to what she needed. She thought about what it cost a person to love something carefully for 12 years. The specific endurance of it. The way it changed a person's interior landscape. Not softening it, in his case, but deepening it. The way you could see it, now that she knew how to look, in every choice he had made. Not obsession. Not possession. Something patient and specific and underneath everything, terrifyingly gentle. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with the same quality as that moment in Harrington's sitting room, deliberate, present, entirely without the 12 years of managed distance. I'm going to need time, she said, to find out what I feel when it's not inside a crisis, when there isn't an inquiry or a warrant or someone moving against us. She looked at him. I know what I feel right now. I know what the last 12 years have built in me without my full awareness of what was being built. But I want to know what it looks like when nothing is on fire. That's fair, he said. I'm also going to need you to let me be wrong sometimes, without the contingency plan already in place. Something moved in his face that was the closest thing to an involuntary smile she had ever seen on him. Brief, real, gone quickly. That will be harder. I know, she said. That's why I'm naming it now. He looked at their joined hands on the table. She watched something in him settle. The particular settling of a person who has been braced for impact for a very long time and has been told, with enough credibility to believe it, that the impact is not coming in the form they were braced for. The Carter estate will need someone to oversee the northern routes, he said, after a moment. His voice had returned to something closer to its usual register, but with a different quality underneath, something open. The transition period will be complicated. I have a competent advisor, she said. On your terms. On my terms. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the chamber, with London gray outside and the fire doing honest work, and the documents of 11 days spread across the table in front of them. Two people at the end of a long road, sitting with the specific tiredness of those who have arrived. Evelyn thought about the girl who had grown up inside Blackthorne Manor learning, without knowing she was learning, how to survive a world that was more dangerous than it appeared. She thought about all the things Adrian had given her that he had never named as gifts, The education in reading rooms, reading people, reading the architecture of power and how to move inside it. She thought about him at 26, handed a murdered man's secret, and all the ways he could have set it down and didn't. She understood something about what that kind of choice did to a person. The way carrying something important for long enough changed the shape of you. Not always in the ways you intended, not always cleanly, but genuinely. The way it built a kind of stillness in you that people who had never carried anything that heavy mistook for coldness. Adrian Blackthorne had never been cold. She had always known that. She had simply spent 12 years not examining what the alternative was. The last clerk finished with his documents. The room was theirs. She stood. He stood beside her, and they were two people at the end of something very long, and at the beginning of something that did not yet have a name, and the November light came through Harrington's tall windows and lay across the table and the documents and the 12 years of distance that had finally, at significant cost to both of them, run out of room to maintain itself. Blackthorne Manor needs attending, she said. The staff has been without clear authority for 11 days. Yes. I'd like to go home. He looked at her when she said it, when she said home, with the particular quality of someone claiming a word rather than simply using it. She met his eyes and let him see that she meant it the way she had said it. Not the manor as geography, not the manor as the place she had been kept, the manor as what it had actually been for 12 years, the place where the person she had become had been assembled, carefully and expensively, and with more love than she had understood, out of the materials a difficult world and a complicated man had provided. Then let's go, he said. They walked out of Lord Harrington's formal chamber together, through the building's stone corridors and out into the November street, and London moved around them with its ordinary indifference to the specific weight of any individual passage through its streets. A carriage was waiting. Graves, efficient as always, had anticipated the conclusion. Adrian opened the door and she got in, and he sat across from her, and the city began moving past the windows. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. It was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people who had said the things that needed saying and were now in the new country on the other side of them, learning its geography. Somewhere north of the city, the road opened up and the buildings thinned and the sky came down closer, and the November countryside spread out gray-green and honest on both sides. Evelyn watched it and felt, for the first time in 11 days, the specific luxury of having nothing immediately required of her. Adrian, she said. He looked at her. When we get back, she said, I want to see my father's secondary record. A pause. Yes, all of it, not the parts you've decided I'm ready for. All of it, he agreed, and I want to see the account of what you've been doing for 11 years, the full record. She held his gaze. Not because I'm auditing you, because it's mine to know. All of it was always mine to know. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had finally named. Yes, he said. It was. The road stretched north. The carriage moved through the gray November morning with the steady rhythm of horses that knew the route. Blackthorne Manor was 2 hours away. She thought about what waited there, the rooms she had grown up in, the library where she had spent 100 rainy afternoons, the East Garden that needed work every autumn, the staff who had kept the place running through 11 days of uncertainty, and who deserved, when she walked back through those doors, a clear authority to answer to. She thought about the Carter estate and what it would take to learn it, to make it her own, to build something with it that honored what her father had built without being only a continuation of what he had started. She thought about this woman she was going to become in the next years, not the woman who had been assembled inside someone else's architecture, not the ward, not the protected asset, not the strategic piece. The woman who had walked into an official interrogation at 4 a.m. and held her own. The woman who had read a name in an enemy's face and used it. The woman who had stepped forward in the entrance hall of Blackthorne Manor when every sensible calculation said to stay back. She thought about what it meant to build a life deliberately, with the full knowledge of what it was built on, and who had laid the foundation, and what the foundation had cost. Not clean, not simple, but real, and hers, and capable of bearing weight. Across from her, Adrian was looking out the window at the countryside with the specific quality of a man doing something he had not perhaps allowed himself to do in years. Not managing, not calculating, just looking at the world going past outside the glass with the face of someone who had arrived somewhere they had not been entirely certain they would reach. She watched him for a moment without looking away. Then she looked out her own window. The road north was long and the morning was cold, and the sky was the particular English gray that could go either way, toward more gray, or toward something that broke open into unexpected light. She had learned, growing up in this country, that you could not predict which it would be. You simply traveled and watched and were ready for either. The manor gates appeared in the distance, iron, tall, permanent, home. She felt him look at her when she saw them, felt the quality of his attention shift the way it always shifted when he was reading something in her face. 12 years of that. 12 years of being the most legible thing in his world, without knowing it, without knowing what the reading meant to him. She let him read her now. She kept her eyes on the gates and let him see, fully and without management, what was in her face when she looked at them. Whatever he saw there made him exhale, quietly, almost inaudibly, the kind of breath a person takes when something they have been carrying finally, at enormous cost and over tremendous distance, arrives. The gates opened. The carriage rolled through. And Adrian Blackthorne, the man the kingdom had called a tyrant for 12 years, who had spent 11 of them carrying a truth that was not his to carry alone, and one of them learning, slowly and at great expense, what it meant to set it down. He said nothing. He did not need to. Some things, Evelyn had learned, did not need language. They needed only the patience to wait for the moment when all the distance you had built between yourself and the truth finally ran out. When the walls you had made from necessity became the walls you were trapped inside. When the only way forward was to be, simply and entirely, and without the armor, the person you actually were. The carriage stopped. The door opened. They went inside.